Hey friends, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube channel. My name is Justin and I am one of the pastors here at One Life Church. I want to go ahead and direct your attention to the description below. In the description, you're going to find some links that will help you learn a little bit more about One Life Church. One of the links is for some of the songs that we sing here at One Life. Those will help you know what to experience if you come and join us in person on a Sunday morning. You'll also find a link for our website, and you'll find a link for our social media platforms, and that will help you get to know a little bit more about this church family. Another link that I want to point out is the link for the Bible app. Every Sunday here at One Life, we use the Bible app for our announcements, a link to partner financially with our church family, and also for the sermon notes and scripture readings and all of those things. So you can go ahead before we jump in the sermon and click that Bible app so that you can follow along today. I want to make an invitation. I want to invite you to come and join us in person on a Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. I would imagine that many of you are checking our church out online. You're seeing which church you want to even go and join in person. So if you enjoy the teaching, if you've been watching for a few weeks, maybe it's time for you to go ahead and join us in person on a Sunday morning at 10:30. So come to 1030 Central Drive, Northwest in Concord next Sunday and join us. All right, friends, we're going to go ahead and jump into the teaching. Carrie Smiley is continuing our summer series called Made Alive with Christ. All summer long, we've been studying the book of Ephesians, which is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a group of churches in a region called Ephesus. And today, Carrie is going to be in Ephesians chapter 5. My prayer is that it will be a blessing to you and that it will encourage you to continue to follow Jesus and say yes to Him in everything that you do. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. I'll see you next time.
Hey One Life, welcome to Church Online. My name is Carrie, and today we are continuing our Made Alive with Christ series through Ephesians. And I'm going to be in Ephesians chapter 5 today. Now, before I went into ministry, I've mentioned it a few times, but I was a public school teacher for most of my career. From 2006 to 2020, I taught almost every grade from K to 12, in private schools, online schools, public schools, but for most of that time, I was a public school Bible teacher. I'm going to let that sink in if that's the first time you've heard it. Public school Bible teacher. Yeah, around here. It was a little complicated. I loved it, but it was complicated. I got to write all my own curriculum, but I had to make sure that I only taught the Bible as history and literature, and I could not put any sort of life application or conversion or proselytizing or discipleship, none of that. Literature and history. But because of how I taught the Bible, I would frequently get students from other faiths or even students who openly didn't believe and just wanted to check out what I had to say, and I loved it. It also helped that I kind of had a reputation as a teacher who brought candy and was an easy A, but I could not fail a student who wanted to learn the Bible, and I stand by that decision. But I will never forget one day when one of my non-believing students stopped me in the hall. His name was Matthew, and he was kind of an edgy kid. He had long hair, he's super quiet. And he goes, "Miss Smiley, you write your own lessons?" "Yeah." "And you have to make sure you don't get in trouble for trying to convert us?" "Mm-hmm." "And you also have to make sure that you don't make the Christians mad?" "Yeah." "So basically, your entire job is tap dancing through a minefield, right?" "Yes, Matthew, that is exactly what I do. Tap, tappity, tap, tap." That conversation stuck with me for the rest of my teaching career. Every time I came across a controversial subject, tap, 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 parent phone calls, tap, 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 answering tough questions, tap, tap, tap. It was tough, and it was beautiful, and it laid a foundation for who I am as a minister today. And those minefields, they're still there, albeit different. I mean, I'm sure nobody is going to send me an email being angry that I'm not going to use the King James Version today. I definitely got those. But today, I'm going to get my tap shoes out again. And I'm going to invite you to dance with me through Ephesians 5. There's some big landmines in here. And my aim is not to dance around them, but we're going to attempt to diffuse them and understand them in light of what we know about Jesus and how we are transformed to be like him and love each other like he did. Are you ready? Let's go. Ephesians 5:1. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. That right there, that's the thesis statement for the entire chapter. To be honest, it was kind of the thesis statement for the whole book of Ephesians. Chapters 1 through 3, they explain just how dearly loved we are. Chapter 4 and the first part of 5 teach us how to walk in the way of love. The second part of 5 and then the first part of 6, that tells us how we live sacrificially. So how do we walk in the way of love? Well, Paul goes on to explain it. He says, but among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Whew. That's our first landmine. I mean, has Paul just been pulling a bait and switch this whole time with the "you're an endlessly loved masterpiece of God" stuff? Because now it kind of seems like he's wagging his finger going, no kissing, no cussing, no dirty jokes, no lying, and y'all better watch out for lightning bolts. Yeah, that's not what's going on here at all. Let's diffuse this first landmine with 3 tools in our spiritual bomb disposal unit kit: context, principle, and application. The first thing we must understand about these landmines is that they reflected the cultural writings of that day. When Paul wrote, he wrote in a style that would have been common to his readers. So this particular passage is known as a vice list. Greek and Roman philosophers used them all the time to say, these are the behaviors that are bad and you shouldn't do them. And then there were virtue lists, these are the behaviors that are good and you should do them. But where Paul differs from these philosophers is the way he ties these common literary features to the church and Christ. You see, Ephesus was one of the largest cities in the Roman Empire with a population of 250,000 people. Now, not only was it an important hub of trade and commerce, I've mentioned before that it was the central location for the worship of the goddess Artemis and several other gods in the pantheon. Ephesus was extremely wealthy, and it displayed that wealth in an excess of consumption and pleasure. The word Paul uses here for sexual immorality, it's the word porneia. I mean, you can listen to the first 4 letters of that word and kind of figure out what it means. You see, the sexual ethic of Greco-Roman culture was pretty much open to anything. Pornography, prostitution, the rape of enslaved women, older men with younger boys. About the only thing a free Roman male could not do was take another man's wife. This kind of sexual immorality, it was exploitative, it was selfish, and it was harmful to people in vulnerable positions. Okay, but what about the obscenity, foolish talking, coarse joking? What is that? So this is the only place in the entire Bible where these three words are used in the Greek. We don't have biblical context for these words, but when we look at the context in other writings from that time period, these three words were used to describe these huge ragers that were thrown by Roman men for days and days and days. And in these parties, these men would act a fool. They threw out all decorum. It was a very much anything goes kind of atmosphere where they would all just get blackout drunk with each other. That was a really common thing that happened back then. And then that last one, greed. Now, I've always found it so fascinating that Paul equates greed with idolatry here. Ephesus was rampant in both. And this was the one that probably made the church go, ooh, the most. You see, they weren't worshiping idols anymore, but many of them were still very wealthy. And they wanted to keep that wealth to themselves. Paul was explaining that the hoarding of wealth and an insatiable desire to get more, well, that's still idolatry, even if they weren't literally bowing down to it. So that's our context. That is what these words would have meant to the Ephesians in the first century. It was very common. It dealt with common problems they had in a common language that they understood. But what about the principle of it? Why? Why did Paul feel like he needed to tell the Ephesian church to avoid these vices? We find that out in verses 8 through 11. Paul says, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. For the fruit of light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them." Why shouldn't they participate in these parts of their culture? Because it's not their culture anymore. A few weeks ago, I talked about the way we shine our lights in the darkness and how we show the world a different way to be human. This is another way to do just that. By refusing to blend in and continue doing the things their old culture found acceptable, they stood out as different. And they caused people to take notice. And it exposed the immorality and shined a light on it. But it's important to realize that this exposing, it's not about condemnation. That's not the goal we should have when we expose darkness. Let's look at verse 13. Paul says, "But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light." You see, the goal is not condemnation, but illumination. Think about it this way. When you walk into a dark room and then you flip on a light, you don't look around and go, "Dang, it's really dark in here." No. Once the darkness has been exposed, the room is transformed into a place of light. That's the goal. Not to condemn the world for its darkness, but to transform it into a place of light. Are you ready for the application for this landmine? So how do we live this way? Well, 15 through 20 says this: "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now notice that Paul did not say, I want you to go stand on street corners outside of brothels with big signs that say, you're going to hell. No, that's not how we do it. That's not how we transform the world into a place of light. Paul was calling them to live a life of wisdom and purpose and joy. Ephesians is all about who you are, what you're here for, and how to experience what it's like to be truly alive. Life as a Christian is not a list of fun stuff we're not allowed to do anymore. That's not what Jesus' will for us was. In John 10:10, Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. The Greek word that is used for to the full, perissos, and it means beyond, extraordinary, abundant. See, the kind of self-seeking pleasure championed in the culture of Ephesus and in our own culture, that's just simply a cheap lie. It's going to steal your soul. It's going to harm you. That's not what we were made for. We were made to live an extraordinary life. Being made alive in Christ means we don't have to gain pleasure from exploiting others. It means that we're able to enjoy life without becoming so excessively indulgent that we compromise our reputation, our moral standards, or our health. It means we are wise and we are generous. We don't allow the pursuit of wealth to enslave us. And I love that this section ends with Paul telling the church to just keep on singing, keep on worshiping, keep on encouraging each other. Keep looking for opportunities to thank God for his goodness and his faithfulness. Gratitude, encouragement, and worship are all keys to living abundantly. Are you ready to keep dancing? This next passage, it's a long one, but it needs to be read all together. Ephesians 5:21 through 33. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but a holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church, for we are all members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. As far as landmines go, gender roles in marriage is a pretty big one. But remember, we're not going to dance around it. We're going to look at it head on. We're going to understand what Paul is saying here and how it applies to everybody in this room, married or not. First, some context. We are working with a different culture, in a different time, with certain things that were common to them. It is important to note that Greco-Roman culture, it was all about class. A lower class man had to submit to an upper class woman. An upper class woman had to submit to whoever ranked above her. What Paul was talking about here would not have applied to all men or all women. This was strictly contained within the family. But what we see here is a Greco-Roman household code. These things dated back all the way to Aristotle, who thought women were basically just deformed men. So that's fun. You see, these household codes laid out what they believed to be the best way a middle to upper class Roman household would function. And if the Roman household was strong, then the empire would be strong. So Paul takes this idea of the household code and the empire of Rome, and he changes it to help us understand that the way we treat each other affects the strength of the church as a whole. Paul's changes were pretty interesting. In almost every other household code, women were not told to submit, but to obey. None of the household codes mention anything about men loving their wives. Not to say they didn't, it just wasn't commanded. But they did tell men that they needed to teach their wives philosophy to try and tame them, don't abuse them too much, and also try to contain yourself with your female slaves, but it's totally understandable if you can't. As far as household codes go, Paul was pretty progressive for his time. So let's look at the principles of this section. The core truth of it is found in verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. That was also pretty unique for household codes. There was no one another in a Roman household. The Roman household was a hierarchy: empire, man, woman, children, slaves. But in the Christian household, that is a really difficult word to say, just so you know. Household, there is mutual submission. There's mutual submission because we recognize that all of us are under the authority of Christ and Christ alone. And I think we also might need to define submission here. To submit in this sense means to voluntarily defer to another, yielding up one's will out of respect or love for someone else. And Paul lays out how this mutual submission should go in the next few verses. So how does a wife submit to her husband? Well, the answer is simply complicated. Because Paul doesn't use obedience language. He doesn't tell men to subjugate their wives. He tells wives to recognize their husbands as the head, but in probably the weirdest way possible. Let me tell you what I mean. To get the weirdness of this, we have to understand what's going on in the Greek. You see, so in our language, we've got one word, head. A person can be the head of a company. A head sits between your shoulders. There's the head of the table. There's the head of a river. And somehow it can also mean bathroom, I guess. But in Greek, it's actually not like that at all. There's a couple words. There's archon, which is like, it starts with arch, archon. That's the word for leader or boss, ruler, like the head of a committee, the head of a nation. That would have been archon. But then there's kephale. Now, kephale means the thing that sits between your shoulders. Kephale also was the word that you'd use if you were talking like metaphorically about the source of something, like the head of a river, the kephale of a river. Okay, so anyone want to venture a guess as to what word Paul uses? Yeah, the one for your noggin. He doesn't use archon. He uses kephale. And that's why just about every commentary gives the scholarly version of the shrug emoji here. You know it's bad when you're reading something like, here are 5 things it could possibly mean, but it is unsure. But I don't want to shrug off this part. I've looked at this and I've tried to make sense of it. And I'm going to offer an interpretation that makes sense to me, and I hope it makes sense to you. First, we need to interpret this in the light of Jesus. We always need to look to Jesus as our example. So Paul says that Christ is the kephale of the church, which is his body. So just like we can't survive without our head, the church would not exist if it weren't for Christ. The church cannot function without Jesus. Christians cannot say, I think I got it figured out. I don't need to deal with Jesus today. Now let's apply that to a marriage. Just like a head and a body, a husband and a wife cannot make marriage work if they are not united. Married women, your husband is a vital part of your life and your family. He is part of you and you of him. If it weren't for your husband, your marriage wouldn't exist. It's not like you're living parallel lives where one person makes the decisions on the house and the money and the kids, and the other person makes the decisions on vacation and food and cars. It doesn't work like that. I think sometimes we hear the word submit and we immediately think it means being a doormat. But that's not what it is at all. Submission in this context is realizing that you're on the same team. That even though you can do it on your own, you won't. It's respecting who your husband is as your partner, as the person you chose to become one flesh with. It's involving him in your decisions and listening to where he's coming from as someone who loves you and wants the best for you. It's giving up some independence and relying on someone else. So let's move on to the way Paul explores submission with men. Now, on the surface, it sort of looks like Paul's letting men off easy. Like all they have to do is love their wives. Great. Believe it or not, men have been loving their wives since the dawn of time. There's all kinds of letters from that time period going on and on about how much these certain men love their wives. So how is this any different? It's because Paul turns the concept of masculinity on its head with the word he uses for love, agape. Agape love is self-sacrificing. Agape love is completely giving oneself over to another with no regard for your own desires. Agape love is the kind of love that Jesus had for us. This word for love is nowhere in the Greco-Roman household codes of that day. Sacrifice was not part of the conversation when it came to men's roles back then. Protect and provide? Sure, absolutely. But sacrifice, that was demeaning. And by Paul comparing what men are to do for their wives to what Jesus did for the church, you mean crucifixion? The absolute most humiliating and emasculating way a person could die? And he's telling men to be like that. Now, what does that look like in a modern marriage? What does it look like to agape love your wife, to sacrifice yourself? It's handing your wife your heart and trusting her with it. It's letting your guard down and inviting her to participate in your life. It's cheering her on and lifting her up. It's serving her, walking alongside her, and learning from her wisdom as she learns from yours. It's realizing that you're on the same team, assuming the best in each other and seeing each other as Jesus does, someone worth leaving heaven for, someone worth hungering and thirsting for, crying for, and giving up every last drop of blood in his body in order to make them his bride. And everyone in the world, whether you're married or not, is a person that Jesus sees as someone worth dying for. So when we're told to submit to one another, it's because we are respecting Jesus' sacrifice for them. We don't exploit people worth dying for. We don't humiliate people worth dying for. We don't ignore the needs of people worth dying for. We respect people worth dying for. And we sacrificially love people worth dying for. Because that is what Jesus did. And we are to make our lives look like him. And I think one of the best passages that does that is the passage I'm going to read for our benediction today. It's in the book of Philippians, chapter 2. Will you extend your hands if you are able as we read through this together? Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Amen. Have an amazing week. You are a person worth dying for.